This is Karl Moore talking management for the Globe and Mail. Today I'm delighted to speak to David Teece, who's a senior professor at the Haas Business School, University of California at Berkeley. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Karl.
David, you're really lucky to be in the Silicon Valley, the center of the universe in some ways for innovation. We see new things happening with business models. What are some of the things you're seeing out there these days?
What I'm seeing is that managers have a lot more choice variables to worry about when designing a business. It's great in many ways because it's not just a matter of producing a widget. You can choose whether you just innovate and maybe license your technology, or perhaps you do produce a product which embodies the technology. Perhaps you give the product away and sell a service associated with the product. But the internet has really given us lots more opportunities, particularly with respect to selling things. So business models which sort of had a structured format maybe 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and now that's up for grabs. And that means a lot more cognitive skill has to go into designing the business. It's nothing more. Designing a business model, in fact, is fundamentally about designing a business. So it really shows there's a creative element to business right from the get-go.
So David, are you arguing it's purely analytical when we put together a business model these days?
We'll call one part of it is definitely analytical, but one should not get into analysis paralysis. There are so many choices that you just have to do some rudimentary shaping up of the opportunities, make some decisions, and move ahead. The new word in Silicon Valley is pivot. It's recognition that you're never going to get it right as you come out the gate, and you're going to have to change, and you're going to have to modify and rejigger your business model till you get it right. So being flexible, being adaptable has a premium on it that's even greater than it used to be.
What you're arguing is that kind of the deliberate strategy approach is more passé, and the emergent approach that Mintzberg talks about is more of what's happening in the Valley, and that's the way forward these days.
Karl, that's fundamentally correct, but it's because of uncertainty. You cannot figure it out up front. The good news is there's lots of choices. The bad news is there's lots of choices. So you have to make the best assessment of the situation. That means your competition, as well as your customers, as well as your suppliers, and you move forward. And the thing evolves. It has to evolve in an adaptive way as you learn more.
David, you've written a lot of important work about competitive strategy and how do we do that. How do you see competitive strategy going forward these days?
Competitive strategy has to go forward in a different tempo than it has in the past. The thing that's been missing from strategy analysis is an assessment and an understanding of capabilities, organizational capabilities, how they're created, how they evolve, how they transform. And without an understanding of that, you may understand markets well, and maybe you possibly understand your competition, but you won't understand yourself. And nor will you understand the fundamental foundations of competitive advantage. Because at the end of the day, how well you do is a function of the capabilities you have and can build and the marketplace you're addressing and your ability to match the two.
So how does a firm understand its capabilities, the things that really drive their ability to be successful in competition?
One would hope that managers will have a deep understanding of their organization's capabilities, but the fact is they often don't. Because a lot of those capabilities have been built up over time. They're part of the history of the company. So one way to understand your capabilities is to understand where you've been, to understand your own history, the things that you can do well, things that you can't do well, and to understand why you do well the things you do well. And then to look at the environment to see if those things are still relevant today and into the future. In the end of the day, it requires a manager not only to sense opportunities, but to be able to seize them, and it requires a new type of manager, one that I call the entrepreneurial manager. Not just for small companies, but for big companies, maybe even especially for big companies, you need entrepreneurial managers. And that's maybe an oxymoron in some people's vocabulary, but it's not in mine.
When we look at the dynamic capabilities and competencies, you've had a ringside seat looking at Apple, how its ups and downs over the years. What have you learned from Apple about competitive abilities?
Well, a number of things. Excuse me. I've learned a number of things. First of all, as Steve Jobs himself was so clear to state, it's not just what you do, it's what you don't do. And when he came back to Apple, you remember, a lot of what he did was to prioritize. Because he had a view and a vision for the way the market was going to unfold. which is something that you can only have if you live in that market and you feel that market and you understand the economic, technological, business trends that are shaping the world we live in. So we understood it, and he got Apple focused. And then combine that with his great passion for great products and the ability to sort of harness the technology of the world to make great products. It was the coupling of the two that really made Apple go, in my view. And then the brilliance of designing an ecosystem and coming up not just with a product, which was the iPad and the iPhone, but the iTunes Store and related complements that created a friendly and workable ecosystem. Microsoft never figured that out. No one's done it as well as Apple, and that's part of the brilliance of Steve Jobs.
The question is, can it continue to have that kind of success? Not only Tim Cook, but the whole organization. Do you think that Steve managed to put that in the DNA of Apple?
That's a deep question. I believe it is in the DNA of Apple. And he put it in there both directly. I mean, they did put some emphasis on sort of teaching the Apple way, but probably a lot of it was indirect, namely, this is the way he did things. People, I think, have gotten over time a deep appreciation for how things worked under Steve, and he certainly has got some products for Apple with long runways ahead of them. I'm thinking of the iPhone and the iPad, the tablet market in general. So they're good for a decade. Whether they're good for two is yet to be seen. But I do think that there's a lot of Steve that remains, even though he's gone. And Tim Cook is maybe, he certainly understands what Steve did. I don't think he can ever replicate what Steve did, but he may not have to for Apple to be successful for several decades ahead.
David, you've talked about the need for entrepreneurial managers in big companies, perhaps even more than in small companies. Why is that, and how does a manager become an entrepreneurial manager in a large organization?
Karl, the reason it's so critical is the environment is changing much more rapidly than it used to be. What that means is that whoever is running the show has to sense what the next big thing is, what the next big challenge is, what the next big opportunity is. And that requires a different mindset from that of a manager. A manager focuses on doing well with what they got. An entrepreneur is about new combinations. Let's go back to Schumpeter. That's what he defined the entrepreneur and innovation to be, was new combinations. So I'm not sure our existing managers will cut the mustard, but there's an onus on the board of directors when they think about who to bring in for the future of their companies, whether they're big or small, to put an emphasis on getting managers who not only can manage down through a hierarchy, but can manage out into a network, and who have a deep understanding of the competitive environment and the technologies that are out there, because if they don't bring those skills together, the chances of the organization succeeding are pretty low.
So if I was a young manager, I would agree with what you're saying. I can see that. How do I become an entrepreneurial manager within a big organization?
Well, I think one way is to maybe start living in a small organization. And then when you move over to the big organization, you'll immediately feel the constraints of a large organization. And hopefully you can start to reverse engineer some of those constraints to create more flexibility. Part of that is unpacking the hierarchy, less levels, because it's very hard to tear apart a hierarchy. But if you shorten the decision chain, and if you make the hierarchy a little shallower, you got a better chance of being more flexible. So I think some experience in both environments is important. Otherwise, if you go straight to a big company, we will never understand very well what the alternative is.
The world looks to Silicon Valley as kind of the future of how do we run businesses. What are the 2 or 3 key things that the world can learn from the Valley in terms of how to be successful? It's a more demanding environment than we're in. What can we learn from them?
That's a very good question, and I think there's several things. One is, in Silicon Valley, no one believes in deep hierarchies. There are more hierarchies here on the East Coast than there are on the West Coast. So creating organizations that are relatively flat is one thing you'll get from Silicon Valley. Creating organizations that are open. By that I mean open to new ideas, open to new technologies, open to opportunities is also critical. Thirdly, I would say compensation and incentives. Certainly incentives are not the whole thing, but having a high-powered incentive environment where people are rewarded for stretching and succeeding, that's something that one should nurture. And along with that, you've got to remove the penalties associated with failure. Not all of the penalties, but at least soften it, because if you don't screw up every now and again, the chances are that you're not taking enough risk. You need to be taking measured amounts of risk so that you have a chance to succeed.
The world would love to be the Silicon Valley, and we see the Silicon Glen, we see that all over the world. When you look at the growth of China, China's good at copying. They're trying to be what the Valley is. Do you think that China, India will be the Valley someday, or is that an impossible target?
You're right. Everybody wants to mimic Silicon Valley. And this is where we have to realize that there's certain national attributes and certain national institutions that we have which actually help. You know, one is there's two great universities there. I'm referring to University of California, Berkeley, and Stanford. And it's going to take China and India a long time before they have institutions that great. Secondly, there's a culture. There's very much a can-do culture, and there's a state of mind around entrepreneurship and around addressing opportunity and about, you know, as Steve Jobs says, putting a dent in the universe. So that's something that's hard to replicate, but nevertheless, that part is probably easier to replicate than the first part, namely the great institutions. And third, you know, you've got to get the capital and the culture and business rubbing shoulders together. And perhaps they can engineer that too. So I think that anyone that really understands Silicon Valley can, over time, put this together. So in the US, we shouldn't get too self-satisfied with what you got, because it can be replicated, albeit it takes a lot of work and both a national and a private effort to do so.